Good afternoon. Welcome to this panel discussion entitled Gender Parity, Where Do We Stand? I am Priska Shawi, UNOG Gender Focal Point, and I am accompanied by my colleague, Mrs. Sigrun Aberman, who is also UNOG Gender Focal Point. We are privileged today to have two distinguished speakers with us. Mrs. Kathleen Kraft-Buchman, welcome Kathleen, and His Excellency Ambassador Matthew Wilson. I would like to thank you all for joining this event, be it here in the library or online. I have been informed there are many people following our event online. We would have liked to have you with us here in the room, but we know that with all the technology, now it's good also to have online participation. Actually, before coming here, I asked our two speakers if they could tell me how they would like to introduce themselves. I would like to start with you, Kathleen, but she told me before the beginning of the event not to say everything, but I'm going to say everything because you deserve it. So Kathleen is the CEO and founder of Women at the Table, the A+Alliance for Inclusive Algorithm, and the AI and Equality Human Rights Initiative. She's also a serial NGO founder. She's the proud co-founder of International Gender Champion, IGC, which has contributed to the organization of this event alongside the Office of the UNOG Director General, which is represented here by Mrs. Lidia Grigoreva. Welcome also, Lidia. To go back to you, Kathleen. Kathleen is also the IGC the digital and new, she's also co-chairing, the IGC representation and the IGC Digital and New Emerging Technology Impact Group. She sits on the global IGC board along Ambassador Matthew. So once again, thank you, Kathleen, for all what you are doing for gender parity, and thank you for being with us here. I move to you, Ambassador Wilson. I'm going to call you Matthew during all this discussion. So Matthew Wilson serves as the ambassador and permanent representative of Barbados to the UN, the WTO, and other international organizations in Switzerland. He's an international gender champion, and he also serves on the board of IGC. He has over 25 years of experience in trade and development. He has previously worked at the WTO and the International Trade Center, and he knows very well the UN system. And he's passionate advocate for diversity and inclusion. Once again, thank you for being with us. Why are we gathered today here? There are many reasons, but the main two reasons are the following. Our Secretary General, Mr. António Guterres, recognized lately that while we have achieved progress regarding gender parity, the road is still very long. There is still a lot to be done. And that's why he issued a gender parity acceleration plan that you might be aware of, which is really a wake-up call for all of us to move forward regarding gender parity. Another reason is that UNOG is currently updating its gender policy. We adopted our gender policy in 2016, and it's time for us now to update it. So the input that we are going to get from the two experts from the field is really very important for us, and we are looking forward to listening to your input. Before I move forward, I'm going to give you the floor, Lidia, as representative of the Director General, Mrs. Valovaya, who couldn't make it due to prior commitment. So the floor is yours, and then we will move to our panel discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Priska. You hear me? Yes. Good afternoon, ladies, and gentlemen. And welcome to everybody who is joining us online. It's my great pleasure to come today. And I would like to thank very much Sigrun and Priska, our UNOG Gender Focal Points, for organizing this event. And it's a pleasure for me to be in the company of two distinguished international gender champions, Ambassador Wilson, of course, and Caitlin, who is the founding member of the International Gender Champions Initiative. So that's great to be here with you because it changed our landscape in international Geneva on gender forever. I'm transmitting my greetings from Madame Tatiana Valovaya, Director General of the United Nations Office at Geneva, who is also herself international gender champion, and she is the first woman to hold this position as Director General of UNOG. And for me, it's a specific pleasure to join because I used to be Gender Focal Point for 7 years before I transmitted this honorable task to Sigrun and to Priska in January. And that was why I abandoned that, is because I was promoted to the Chief of Staff position. So that would be a conflict of interest for me to remain. And incidentally, I'm the first woman to hold this position as well. So things are changing. So where do we stand on gender parity? So I'm just coming here with a few thoughts. And I brought with me a copy of the first ever UNOG policy on gender equality and the empowerment of women that Priska referred to and that they're currently revising. That was adopted in 2016. And at the time when this policy was adopted, this was 1 year before the Secretary General's strategy. So we kind of moved the clock before he moved that. And the numbers were the following. We had 44% of women in professional categories across UNOG, with only 38.6% of women in senior positions. And in the UN Secretariat, across the Secretariat, gender parity was at 34.4% women only. So that's where we started the journey. And now, fast tracking to today, I'm very proud to say that we did reach parity at professional levels, not only across UNOG, but also at each professional category. So every P2, P3, P4, P5, and above in the senior positions as well. This was done first time in 2020. And then now it was solidified further in 23, and now in 24 the numbers remain the same, so parity has been achieved. And that was not achieved, of course, by accident. That was achieved because there was a lot of things done, and some of the things that helped are the following. First, it was important to have the commitment of the Directors General and the senior management of UNOG to promoting gender equality. Both the previous Director General, Michael Muller, and the current Director General, Madame Valovaya, they are seriously committed towards gender equality and gender parity. We have targeted recruitment practices, for example, promoting job openings on social media, encouraging the hiring managers to share the job opportunities broader and to monitor recruitment processes to ensure parity. There is also mandatory gender training and participation actively in internal and external career events helped also enable the greater awareness in our hiring culture. Integration of gender-responsive management practices, such as updating job titles and having gender-inclusive language and gender-sensitive language in communications, that also helped. And also, I think this year we are celebrating the 10 years of our career development support for women training, which is called Emerge, and which recently received the high prize as a decade of excellence at the 2024 International Organizations Career Development Roundtable. So that's big applause for the people who are managing it. And this is done across UN entities in Geneva. So it's not only UNOG initiative, but it's the inter-agency initiative. And also lots of efforts have been put in doing the enabling environment in the organization and looking at the culture change, including through activities like work on sexism or against sexism in the workplace, flexible working arrangements, which have been in UNOG introduced even before COVID, which of course taught us all how to telecommute, but at UNOG we started doing it before, and that actually prepared us better, I think, for COVID. So the numbers are important, but achieving real parity and real equality goes beyond numbers, and it goes to the organizational culture. And all of these initiatives are helping us to create this culture where we have equal opportunities for both women and men. We had but we had some pushbacks from men who were saying when we started this work to say, you know what, I mean, the woman is selected for the position just because she is a woman and men are overlooked because you need to promote the gender parity. But now we have gender parity, so there is no issue anymore. Now both men and women have equal opportunities and can compete equally. And it's not that women were put on the position because she wouldn't have the same professionalism as a man would have for that position. It's just that we consciously had to put a woman if we saw that the numbers were not equal in that professional category. So a lot has been done, and I know that Priska and Sigrun are now challenging more the organizational culture and looking also beyond gender equality, because of course we have to sustain what we have achieved, gender parity, but we have to look at other issues as well, at the cross-sectoral issues like gender and disability inclusion, like gender and anti-racism, like non-binary elements of the gender as well. And what helps us with all this internal work is what I referred to before about the International Gender Champions Initiative, because it also came at the same time when we started implementing our policy. Because this initiative is really targeting leaders in international Geneva. Well, it's an international initiative, so it's beyond Geneva. But let's say in Geneva, all heads of international organizations are encouraged to be gender champions and to commit to do actions in their organization for parity. And also the permanent representatives are also encouraged to join. My Director General, when the new ambassadors are coming to present her letters of credence, she always encourages them and invites them to join Gender Champions Initiative. So all that helps, but we need to do more, and I'm looking forward to hear from our distinguished speakers on what we can do more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lydia. And indeed, I have been working for 20 years in the EU at UNOG, and I can attest that things have changed a lot, and the culture has changed a lot, but we still have to long way to go, and we don't have to forget the importance of gender parity. Know that we are talking more and more about different aspects of diversity. So I'm going to start with the first question to our speakers. I'm all the time looking at Kathleen, and even though it has to be ladies first, I'm going, based on the gender parity, to turn towards you, Matthew, with my first question, and also it's also addressed to you, Kathleen. So, as I said at the beginning, efforts have been made, progress has been made, be it in the UN or outside the UN. We are not equal. We see that there is a level of disparity between organizations. But despite all this, the overall situation is a little bit discouraging. So I would like to know, in your opinion, what are the main obstacles towards achieving gender parity? You may wish to talk about what's happening, in the outside world, in your work as member as a diplomat, but also you can touch upon some obstacles that you noticed when you were working for the UN. And Kathleen, I will give you the floor afterwards. So the floor is yours, please.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Priska. And it's a real pleasure to be on this panel. Caitlin is not only a tremendous gender champion, she's a good friend. And Priska, you should not undervalue the role that you have played the last couple of years on issues around diversity, inclusion, and equality. You and I were on the UN working group on racism in the UN a couple of years ago. So I know your advocacy, and it's great to hear all the excellent work that the Director General is doing here. I think it's so important. But where we are globally on gender issues today, frankly, it can be very discouraging, but we cannot be discouraged because it's a constant journey, many stumbles, sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. The important thing is that you continue to be walking and facing in the right direction, which from what I hear from you, UNOG is. But we cannot take the progress that has been made here in UNOG for granted. It's very difficult to climb to the summit. It's very easy to be pushed from that summit back down. So you have to constantly keep your eye on the prize, on pushing gender equality. Now for me, the obstacles are systemic, they're cultural, and they're personal. And in a way, Chief of Staff, you mentioned all 3 of those in your opening statement. And for me, all 3 of these demand separate but interrelated interventions. So if we take the UN system, UNOG, as a small ecosystem, is bureaucratic, is culturally diverse, is made up with people of very strong personal opinions and views. And this is why I think the UN system-wide approach to gender equality was such an important systemic step. Because the UN, like countries, like companies, you would not be able to achieve what you have been able to achieve without it not being, I don't want to say imposed top-down, but for the right signals to be sent from the top, for management to have buy-in, for management to show why this is so important. Because as sad as it is to say, equality and equity do not happen automatically without interventions, because we've had millions of years of certain inequities, and we cannot expect organizations to naturally progress to a state of equity or representation without systemic changes and without these changes being intentional. So, when I look at the UN SWOP and I look at the SG's very clear targets around gender equality, the frameworks, the toolbox, the indicators, the metrics, I think is all very, very important. The only thing is, a vision or a policy that is not properly financed or not properly resourced is a wish list. So we have to make sure that when we have these gender equality policies and regulations and interventions, that they're budgeted for as well. That's really important. And that doesn't often happen enough in the UN system. We're very good at or I should say you, I'm no longer in the UN system. You're very good at sometimes saying the right things, but it's equally important to back up those statements with resources and dedicated funding. And when you look at the document that was put out, I think it was maybe in 2022, UN parity, how can we reach gender parity by 2028? I mean, it really is an excellent collection of good practices, which I think international organizations can learn from each other, and I think they're very scalable. Now, the cultural obstacles, I think, are a little bit trickier, because the very nature of the UN means it has to be international, and it has to be representative. This means that you also have to be open to countries, individuals, groups who have different histories, who have different cultural norms. And unfortunately, some of these histories, some of these religions, some of these cultural norms may not always embrace gender equality in the way that we would want them to. It may not also embrace the rights of vulnerable populations in the way that we think that they should. So what does one do in a situation like that? Just a couple months ago at the UN General Assembly, my Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, a fierce advocate of equality, who just happens to be a woman, she made her General Assembly statement. And one thing that she said, and I quote, "The UN Charter speaks to we the people, not we some of the people." So if you're working for the UN, in my estimation, clearly you need to abide by, respect, and follow the basic tenets of the UN Charter, one of which is equality. And this very famous quote, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." But my view is that if the UN culture is strong enough to unify people despite their different cultural backgrounds, then you're going to see a lot of progress. And then finally, the personal view. And these are individual issues, the personal perspective. Unfortunately, the UN cannot automatically change people's minds. You can't make people believe in gender equality. You can't make people believe in rights for indigenous people or LGBTQI+ people. You can't do it. But it can help, the UN can help to change behaviors and show what you have zero tolerance for. And sometimes when you change behaviors, you can actually change mindsets and perspectives. So the UN has to be very clear on zero tolerance towards any forms of discrimination, including gender equality. This means having accountability frameworks. This means empowering employees to speak out in safe spaces when they feel that they're seeing or feeling something that does not abide by this notion of equality and fairness. And it also means empowering women, and this is so important, empowering women to know and feel that they deserve equality. Because how many young women do all of us in this room or online know who don't want to apply for jobs because they feel that they are not good enough, or that they don't have the skills, or that they're not going to be taken seriously, or that the system is prejudiced against them? We have to also work with young women in the UN system to know that they deserve equality and they deserve to put themselves up for the competitions for the various levels in the UN. That equality is a right, equality is not a gift, it's not a nice to have. So that's my kind of three perspectives: the systemic, the cultural, and the personal. And we see all of them happening in the global space right now, and I see it happening in the UN system as well. And I think some of the efforts that UNOG and UN in New York and the different agencies have made have been really quite transformational, but we cannot take that for granted. Thanks.
Thank you very much for these inspiring answers. So you mentioned mainly the systemic, the cultural, and the personal obstacle. I would like to know, Kathleen, from you, if you see other type of obstacles, or if you have the same vision maybe about, these three categories of obstacle Matthew mentioned. Please, you can elaborate on it. One thing before I give you the floor. You founded Women at the Table, and Matthew mentioned that very often women don't believe, young women mainly, don't believe that they have the right to be there, to be at the table. How do you think can we empower the new generation and also the old generation who still does not see themselves as owner of right, but rather, as people waiting for other, I wouldn't say to be charitable towards them, but to help them be empowered? Thank you.
Thank you, Priska. So Women at the Table is a systems change organization, right? So we look at things from the prism of systems as feminists. And as feminists, we look at gender, race, class, and caste being all inextricably interlinked and integrated, so that that is our approach, is an intersectional approach, as a feminist approach. I've got to say, I'm going to look at this. I love the tripartite way that you looked at this. I'm going to take another three-part way of looking at things, which actually comes from Professor Londa Scheibinger from Stanford, who's done a lot of incredible work on gendered innovations. And she says that there are three things. First, it's fix the women. Then it's fix the system, and then third is to fix the knowledge, which is the way that we look at it. So yes, we need to fix the women and teach them to be empowered and that they have rights, but we don't, in our work, really look at it that way. We just say that we need for women to know, young women in particular, that they're rights holders, that these rights come by virtue of their being human. And that they need to go forward. But what we really need to do is fix the system so that the system is a little bit more forgiving and more open and more inclusive and lets them in, which is less of a cultural thing. And as I'm sure you all know, there's this notion of substantive equality in the CEDAW document, the Convention to End Discrimination Against Women. So, it says, of course, we have equal opportunity, so everybody has an equal chance to apply, right? But not everybody has the same positionality. They don't have the same position from which to apply, right? They were either from geography or physical ability or gender or race. So substantive equality is about really helping people who don't have the extra leg up from being, a classic demographic of a white male from the north, people who don't have that extra oomph into, jettisoning into the system, is how can we sort of help the system be more inclusive and help these people, help everybody. Basically, it's most of the world, right? It's probably 80% of the world, be able to sort of access the same opportunities so that the world can benefit, right? So we can have more creativity and innovation. Because I'm completely convinced that we can solve a lot of our problems by including more diverse perspectives and ways into things. So, and CEDAW, which came up with this notion, legal notion of substantive equality, also has just in the last month and a half come out with a general recommendation 40, which is about parity for women in all forms of decision making. So, it's a beautiful document. It really talks about economic parity. It talks about parity in technology, and goes forth with a lot of really interesting recommendations. So I encourage everybody to look at that and think about it. I think I have a lot of structural ideas. So fix the way. I didn't mean to be like, how can we not help? But I do think we do say that women don't feel strong enough about applying, and it is true. All the research shows that women, especially young women, feel they have to be 100% qualified for a job in order to put themselves forward, where men, statistically, according to this research, were maybe could be have half the qualifications, but felt that they could put themselves forward. So there's a lot of cultural work that we do need to do. But I do also think that we need to actually just do the systemic change to help, and I have some granular ideas there too. Last thing I just want to mention is fixing the knowledge, which is also what knowledge actually we embrace, what do we value. For example, in work that we're doing in AI, we wrote we were the technical authors of a data inclusion standard. And in that standard, we tried to take away the idea of technical expertise, because we look at technical experts as more important than maybe community activists. So this idea of the knowledge, of whose knowledge is really important, and people with lived experience of what's happening actually have the authenticity and the insights that perhaps even more, certainly more effective and more truthful than technical experts. So this whole idea of what knowledge that we embrace has something also to do with our getting to parity and making everybody feel comfortable with it, I think.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go back to you regarding the ideas you have about the systemic changes that we can embrace. But before doing so, I want to touch upon the intersectionality that you mentioned at the beginning of your intervention. And I think you may be aware that the UN today is no more focusing only on gender parity, but it's focusing on disability inclusion, it's focusing on fighting racism, because we recognize that there is racism. So I would like to know from you, Matthew, how can we get all the diverse aspect of diversity being embraced without forgetting about gender parity? Because, there are sometimes as some people say, it's a fashion now. We are talking about gender parity, tomorrow about disability inclusion. So how can we work on the diverse aspect of diversity without forgetting gender parity?
Thanks, Priska. I'm here sitting down on this panel, and I'm actually, as we speak, having a bit of an existential crisis, a minor breakdown. I'll tell you why. Because in my intervention, I talked about how it's important, if you are in the UN, a UN employee, that you abide by the treaty. Even if you have, cultural norms, religious norms, histories that may not always embrace gender equality. If you're in the UN system, working in this space, you must abide. But then I think to myself, but doesn't that create some kind of tension with, for example, what Caitlin said and what I believe, which is you also have to have diversity of opinion and diversity of perspective and diversity of history. So who is the one who gatekeeps what is the appropriate cultural norm to be part of that mix? Is an open question, is one that really just struck me, and I'm not sure. Because even though I personally may have a problem, let's say, with certain religions that don't see women as equal contributors, who am I really to say that that religious belief should be kind of put into a corner? I don't know. It's something that we don't talk about enough because it's very, very sensitive. But listen, on this issue of intersectionality, I feel very strong about this because I think having gender parity 50-50 is great, but not if the 50% of the women that you have look the same, or think the same, or are from the same country. It's not, for me, true equality if 40% of those 50% comes from Europe, for example. For me, that's not representation. As a global institution, and I said this before and I'll say it again, the UN needs to look like the people and the communities that it serves. Any organization with the title Global, World, International in the title has got to look like the people it serves. So we need to go deeper than just 50-50 parity between men and women. We need to look at different groups to make sure different races and ethnicities are represented, different ages. Ageism is a serious problem that we don't talk about enough. Different life experiences. We have to have people with disabilities. We need indigenous community representation. We need LGBTQI+ representation. We need people of African descent, people of Asian descent, small island developing state representation, LDC representations. I could go on and on. Essentially, we just need to have a UN employee pool that looks like the countries that we are and people that we are representing. And this is, again, not something that happens automatically. It takes intentional policies. It means that your outreach has got to be planned. It's got to be strategic. You can't just put a job description out there or a job opening into the ecosystem and hope that it finds itself to Kiribati or Papua New Guinea or Samoa or St. Lucia or Rwanda. You need to be intentional about how you get these opportunities out there. Hiring practices, let's be clear, hiring practices do have inbuilt prejudices. I mean, when I was at ITC, we did a lot of work on unconscious bias. And unconscious bias is real against women and against people who do not look or talk or have the same experiences of the people who are leading the interviews. And I can tell you, I know this from experience, where I was the one who was biased against someone who English was not their first language, because they couldn't express themselves in the same way that someone who had English as a first language was able to express themselves. A switch almost automatically went off in my mind. And thank goodness I did that unconscious bias training, because I was able to recognize where my mind was going and pull back. So in the UN hiring practices, everybody who has that role and responsibility needs to have this kind of training. But, and I want to go to something that you had said earlier, Chief of Staff, we also need to listen to those who are going to be negatively affected in the short term by these intentional efforts to rebalance equity. I have to tell you that I have a number of women friends who are, of course, fierce believers in gender equity, but who have come to me and said they're concerned that the gender equity policies of the UN, the diversity and inclusion policies of companies are going to negatively affect their son's ability to get a job. So it's funny that you can believe in this from a philosophical perspective until it gets personal. And then you start to worry, you start to wonder. So we need to have these difficult discussions with people. We need to have these difficult discussions with men who will not have the kind of automaticity that they may have had before. Because it does mean that you will have some excellent male candidates who may not get a position because you do have indicators and metrics that you have to meet for gender parity. And we need to handle those people with care and sensitivity, because their perspectives are valid. So rebalancing for me is necessary, but it's not always easy. I mean, true change is hardly easy anyway. But my perspective is that the UN cannot dismiss these people because their views are also very valid, and we have to create this space for an uncomfortable conversation, even as we go towards making sure that we have a more representative organization.
Thank you. I will turn to you, Kathleen. I think you have things to say about intersectionality.
I do. I think the first thing is that if you're going to work for the UN, I know that you believe this, Matthew, but just in case it didn't come off exactly the way that you may have meant, I think if you're working for the UN, you have to abide by the UN Charter, which says all men and women, all humans, actually it says all humans are equal. So I think that when you come into this building writ large around the globe, I think that that's something that you've signed on for, regardless of whatever your cultural expectations or your heritage may or may not be. That's working at the UN. Also, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as I'm sure everybody knows, is the first time ever, it's a UN document, that we said, all humans are created equal. It was no longer all men are created equal. It was the first time women were, it was assumed that if you meant men, default women, right? So I think that we're all signing on to that, and we're all signing on to the treaties and the human rights frameworks that our colleagues have worked so hard on, which, talk about not only political and civil rights, but also economic and social rights. And so that whole box of wonderful rights is, I think, something that's our point of departure. That's number one. Number two, about intersectionality, I think, and I'm a bit worried that gender gets left off, but I think that we have to think of ways to elegantly integrate frameworks, because we see this also for impact assessments now, also in this world that I'm more and more living in terms of algorithmic impact assessment. But we know that we have to understand what's happening in the environment, but we also have to understand impacts on gender. We have to also understand impacts really in the care economy and how that new economy is going to look. And I think instead of having, often we proliferate, there are all sorts of things that are jerry-rigged and we keep on adding on layers, that this is a moment for us to think about how to elegantly integrate all those different kinds of concerns so that we can genuinely and effectively work on all those things at the same time, because it's not a question of, well, we need, there's climate change, it's pressing, therefore we can't deal with women's rights in the South, who are actually most affected by climate change, and youth. So we have to look at this really as an ecosystem, and I don't know whether we've had enough of an ecosystemic approach as much as we can. We talk about something like ageism and job recruitment, and I'll talk again about more granular things, but when you have numbers of years in a job, you're basically automatically discounting a lot of youthful people who might be applying because you can't, or women who have taken some time out to raise their children or even just to have parental leave. So you're sort of, there's certain things that maybe we may or may not be aware of that automatically throw people out of the system. In addition, there's also a class, because I said it's gender, race, class, and caste. When we talk about reaching out throughout the world, it is often the most privileged among those in the most disadvantaged countries of the world, right? So it's only sort of a certain class that is getting to go to universities, maybe throughout in other places. So I think we also have to look at that, because you don't want to have only elites. So it's great. We need the geographic diversity, but we need to have more than just the elites from a geographically diverse set of places. Which also brings me to men, which you brought up. So there was this famous, there was this guy, he used to do this talk, he said, well, there was a Jerry Springer thing on TV, and it was, the headline was, it was one of these combative TV shows, and it was like, we're gonna talk about a black woman took my job. And then he said, now, he asked in his training, he goes, what's the wrong word in that sentence? And you have to think about it for a while, but he said, the word is my. Because why did the job belong to those white guys that are sitting there? So it is this question of entitlement. I mean, it's been the history, this has been basically Western culture, has been an affirmative action program for white men from certain classes. And so we need to embrace that. On the other hand, we also need to be sensitive to the fact, first of all, power doesn't cede gently, as we've seen recently in elections around the world. So it doesn't really help to say what I've just said at all. But I think we also have to, come up with new definitions of also what masculinity and what definitions of what femininity mean, right? So we're very much stuck in sort of old definitions, and what, in a weird way, I think as feminists, and I would pin this on US feminists in particular, did wrong was just to say to our daughters, and I have a daughter and a son, daughters, you can do anything, you can just be like a guy, go, go, go. But we never gave men or boys an alternative for anything except for girls to come into their space. And also by doing that, it's like, you can do anything a guy can do. We sort of left the idea of that girls actually have any value by them, right? It's like we all want to do the boy, and actually I understand that, because we all want to do the boy stuff, because the boy stuff is the cool stuff. We left, in a weird way, no place for there to be sort of interaction. And I think that we have to work on that to include, when we talk about including everybody, that's also having these conversations with boys and men who may feel left out. And I will end on a positive thing. I'm old enough to remember somebody going into the Clinton administration, and who had the chance to be like an assistant secretary of state, but was taking instead a backseat to a very brilliant black woman who had been his student. And I said, but you could have this job. He said, we've all thought about it long and hard, and we looked at South Africa, and we realized in South Africa, unless some people just took a step back, it would always be the people with the most experience, and in South Africa, it would have been the white people, because they were the only people who had been allowed to participate. And somebody sometimes has to take a step back and let other people lead so that we can have the world that we all believe in so deeply. And his career was fine, and he's gone on to do amazing things. But I think that was also interesting, because it really is, we have to think about, and it means that people of privilege, that would include people that look like me, are going to have to sort of sometimes take a step back and say, how can we, like we do on panels, that change that we affected, all of us together, about panels at the UN. It was normal to have 5 or 6 wonderful, older, white men talk about the future of humanity all the time. And it wasn't until we said, you really need to have some women on a panel. You can no longer have all male panels. That we made that change. And actually it's sort of, I think it's reverberated, it's cascaded into other places. And I think that we also need to do that about different kinds of perspectives. As you said, those other perspectives that are difficult and maybe have on occasion disagreement, and because that's only going to make things more interesting. Thanks.
Can I come back on something there? Because I want to bring something you said back to the UN, back to UNOG, and that is about this idea of gender roles for men and women, boys and girls. We talk about gender parity here in the UN system, but and I hate to make this differentiation between P and G jobs. It's ridiculous. But anyway, it is what it is. If you do look at the G jobs, you probably have 95% women. Why is that? Is it because men have been taught that you cannot be secretaries and admin assistants? And and I don't know if the UN system looks at that enough. If you look at the IT teams in any UN organization, you're probably going to have 90% men. We need to be a little bit more intentional in those areas as well. There's some teams that I know in the UN, including in my former life, where hiring managers only seem to hire people who look, think like them. Mm-hmm. And you would have, for example, a team that I knew very well covering climate change that were only people from Europe or the US to cover climate change, which, as you know, is going to affect developing countries the quickest and the earliest and the most severe. So again, they're not taking on board the different perspectives which I think is critical if you're going to have real and impactful policies.
I think I'm looking at the clock, and the discussion is getting more and more interesting. I want to give you the floor for the last question I have to you before we open the floor to the participant, be it online. And I encourage all the participants online to put their question in the chat, and those who are in the room to think about their question. You will be given the time to ask your question to the participants. So my last question to you, I think you have encountered many positive initiatives in order to champion gender parity in real terms. Could you share with us one or two best practices that you would like to, that you found really groundbreaking and that you advise us to carry on or to implement?
Yeah, I'm going to mention one or two that we were involved with just because I think it could inspire the idea that others can come up with their own. So one of the things that I realized in the beginning of Gender Champions was how much power the bureaucracy had in this really strange way. Because we're saying we can't change, there's certain things we can't change, and we're stuck here, and it's the UN. And then all of a sudden, one of the colleagues said, well, you know, we set the temperature in the room, and we decide who's on the dais. And we decided who's taking notes. And we started to decide that we would look at policies that were just these kind of bureaucratic things that mostly women were in charge of, but that they could actually help open up the whole conversation. So indeed, this wound up being the Gender Responsive Assemblies Toolkit that uses best practices from all of the different UN agencies, some of which are really quite, even I suppose today you would think they were radical. Not one of them is done by every agency all the way through the kind of the spectrum. So it's really interesting, but it's everything from WMO, who changed itself, who was mostly an all male when we started, even the IPCC at that point, 2015, like all men. They put up just on the wall, walking into their assemblies, just what the percentage of women delegates were. And what they found, which was interesting, is that the men were like, really, there's so few? Because they saw you, they just thought there were women there, but they didn't really sort of understand the proportions. Anyway, there are all these different things, including ILO, saying, dear colleagues in a region, we have made a commitment from the General Assembly, however they govern themselves, to have 50% parity, and we noticed that you have 12% from your countries and your region. Can you do something about it? And by the second or the third year, they would say, would you like us to come to your country and identify and train the women who should be delegates on your behalf? So they really kept on going deeper, gave people a chance to change. And I do think that that's when I talk about these structural tweaks and hacks that you can to sort of change a little bit like a Rube Goldberg machine. You can sort of change the temperature in the room and make things change. So I'll just stop right there.
Thank you. Matthew?
No, and that's exactly what I mean about intentional policies. These things don't happen automatically. Yeah? People need to be brave, especially people in management who are, you know, they're in well-paid, secure jobs. Be a little bit more brave. Put some of these policies in place. Two really small examples. One, I used to be chief of staff at ITC, so I feel your pain. And at ITC, we, under the leadership of Arantxa Gonzalez, who was the executive director at the time, we launched a program called She Trades Initiative, which Caitlin was also very much involved in. And this was really focused on providing capacity building, technical assistance, advocacy, platforms to women entrepreneurs and women small businesses all over the world. So the message was clear that one of ITC's main pillars was the economic empowerment of women. Now, if this is one of your main pillars as an organization, you need to make some structural changes inside. You need to start empowering your own women in your organization. And I think that us doing work outside on women's economic empowerment gave us space to do more work inside. So myself and a number of colleagues, we instituted this diversity and inclusion group. And I think we were one of the first agencies to have a full gamut of focal points covering gender equality, covering persons with disabilities, we had an LGBTQI focal point, we had one for geographical diversity, which is very important for me, but very sensitive. But it was important that we had somebody who was looking specifically at geographical diversity. And I'm so pleased to see it continue to flourish under my colleague Guterres. They're doing excellent work, and now they're doing work on neurodiversity. They're doing, they're commemorating Black History Month. They're doing beautiful things just to raise awareness and advocacy. And when those things happen, you help people to feel like it's a safe space to work. And I remember when I was at ITC as well, we did something as, I say it's simple, but it's not so simple for those who use it. We created a breastfeeding and bottle feeding room for parents, not just women, but for parents. And that, I think, made them feel safe at work. It made them feel that you were not being punished because you were a mother with a young child, that you could bring your authentic self to this space. And I think that's something that other organizations need to do as well. And then second, maybe a little bit more not so interesting, is at the World Trade Organization, where we have a working group on trade and gender. And we have one on micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, which I chair. And we've done a lot of work together to put a showcase on access to finance for women entrepreneurs. Just last week, we had an event on women and IP, helping women entrepreneurs to feel comfortable to use intellectual property to grow their businesses. And I think that these kinds of platforms and advocacies and talking about gender within spaces like trade, which people think are typically very economic focused and very policy oriented and just very dry, I think is important to show people that gender equity, gender equality has a place in every single UN organization, every single international organization, and any space where we are discussing policy.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I'm going now to open the floor for the question. I don't know if, yes, so Natalie, if you can help us with the mic so that people who are...
Working for UNECE. And my question is regarding a very specific UN practice. Because on the one hand, we as a system afford a UN education grant, which means the children of UN staff is enabled to go to good universities, good schools, and the UN system reimburses the costs. On the other hand, we don't have a UN childcare grant. So statistically speaking, at a time when women need the most support, we as a UN system don't provide that support. So my question is, why do we leave women alone at a time when we could successfully empower them and provide really a financial support that would enable them to combine their career aspirations and their personal family life? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any requests for the floor from the room? If not, maybe, Natalie, can we take one or two questions from the online participation, and then I will give the floor to Matthew and Kathleen if they would like to comment.
Yes, sure. So far we have one question online, and that's with regard to actually if we have any data on gender parity at the G level at UN Geneva and globally. I don't know, maybe perhaps Lydia or someone might be able to, if not today, share that with the audience as well. So far that's what we have. Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe I will give the floor to Kathleen and Matthew. I am going to answer about the G level because it's something more internally. And then I will also maybe make some comments about your comments after listening to Kathleen and Matthew. Please.
Yeah, since I've been doing this work, it's a question. There are waves of young parents men and women, saying, where's the crash? Where's the UN crash? And I sat on the board of the International School Foundation for a number of years. So have been in and out of the, it's problematic, and it's problematic because it's very difficult to get a crash certified and paid for, especially in a place like Geneva that has a lot of beautiful rules to take care of things. A solution to that would be giving people child care, a stipend, perhaps. And I think the answer probably is that the system wasn't thinking about women of childbearing age being in the workforce, probably when it came up with all the stipends. And if people are thinking about how to pay for it, maybe the money needs to sort of go down to the childcare level in order to help support women and men who are in their sort of young parenting years and less at the university level, and just sort of redeploy where the money flows. But it absolutely is that people probably never occurred to them that women weren't staying at home and taking care of young children. And it's a huge, huge problem for career trajectory, for sure.
Thank you, Matthew.
I might be a little controversial with what I'm going to say. Well, first of all, we have to remember, if it's childcare, we're talking about men and women, of course, not just women. I can imagine that there are huge parts of the population who may be outside watching the UN system, watching our salaries, watching our benefits, being in the middle of an economic crisis and thinking to themselves, okay, they get education grants for their children to go to school and university, and now they want childcare grants, and they get, what's that allowance that you get when you're in a different country?
Allowance, so yes, mobility.
I can imagine it might be difficult to justify an additional pocket, especially given the financial constraints that the UN system is, the image issues that the UN has with the ordinary person on the street. And that's why I probably agree with Caitlin that a redeployment might be a better way of looking at it, but certainly someone has got to look at it, because I know it's a real problem for some of my colleagues who have young children. Where are they going to stay? It's incredibly expensive. The crashes here in Geneva, I know. You sometimes have to book them even before you're even thinking of having a kid. So it's clearly a situation where the demand far outstrips the supply. Yeah.
Thank you. And maybe on this, before concluding the event, which is a real pity because the discussion has been really very interesting. Having the allowance being paid does not depend on our Director General here in Geneva. It depends on the ICSC, the International Commission for Civil Service, that determine our working condition. And this commission, I don't know if you have read about it, is mainly composed of men who are, maybe have different kind of vision that you and me are having. And the Director General has lately, maybe Lydia can say, if you were tried to put in crash in place here, but it didn't succeed. The DG is open to the idea. We are thinking with Sigrun to see if we can have a daycare option, but I don't think it's going to happen in the near future. But the allowance is not something that depends on our Director General. It really depends on the ICSC that makes recommendation to the General Assembly, and member states have to say yes or no. Regarding the question for the statistic, for the G staff, yes, human resources have all the statistics about all, the category of staff, the distribution. And as Matthew said, I think, and we all know it, that G staff, which has the general service, Kathleen, are mainly made of female colleagues. And that is it's very important that we try also to change. And the Director General is now encouraging us also to look at the parity at the G level, which is something that we will be working on in the coming years. At the time, we had to finish at 1:30. Maybe I will give the floor to my colleague, Sigrun Habermann, just to summarize in a few sentences the main take of this discussion before we concluded officially, thanking both our excellent speakers for a very, very good discussion. So I give you the floor, Sigrun.
Thank you. So let me just summarize a few of the key words, basically, that came up repeatedly. The way we were looking at things here were, first of all, the tripartite, systemic, cultural, and personal. And the other tripartite was fix women, fix the system, fix the knowledge. So whatever the discussion was, it actually always came back to parts of that. What I took out is that for gender equality and intersectionality, it's important to look at our built-in unconscious biases and to have the difficult discussions that also came up several times in different areas with the people that are affected, and to be sensitive to that because obviously all the opinions are valued. And this is our UN culture as well. The UN culture came back also as a point of departure is the human rights. So there are rights. It's not just about culture. It's also about the rights that we're actually incorporating at the UN. There was also something about the way that we work on the outside needs to be reflected on the inside, and I guess the other way around as well. And then Caitlin said also need to integrate frameworks. So it comes back to the systems that we need to work on the different rights and issues at the same time and to see it as an ecosystem. So that really was very helpful for me personally. And to redefine masculinity and femininity in order to move ahead, to progress together. Also on the intersectionality issues as well. And then, of course, you both also brought out a lot the power of bureaucracy, and what we can actually do on the inside would be through the rules that are already in place and that we can change and move forward together like that. Thanks a lot for the discussion.
Thank you, Sigrun, for summarizing. And with this, we are going to conclude this event. Thank you for those who came in person, and thank you also for the participant online. And thank you, Lydia, for having represented the DG in this meeting. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Matthew.